talking. Thank you very much for coming to this session, which is all going to be about getting private money into roads. It's something we've already touched on, but now we've got three experts here to give us a bit more depth about what's going to happen. So please welcome to the stage Steve Norris, who obviously you've met before, David Barwell from ACOM, and Steve Gooding, Director of the RAC Foundation. Now these guys are all going to do a quick 5 minutes and then we're going to have a panel discussion after that. And don't forget the Slido, because it does seem to be working quite well. So basically you either log onto the website or you download the app. You can either put in a question or you can like a question. If lots of people like the question, it goes to the top of the pile. I see them here, so it gives us a chance to see kind of what you guys are thinking. And there'll be microphones as well, but do use the Slido app, because so far it's actually worked very well. So please, first of all, welcome to the stage, Steve Norris.
The budget, as I think we all know, was generally regarded as being a good budget for roads. It's rare to be able to say it, but generally accepted to be true. However, in one critical respect, the Chancellor may have surprised his audience rather more than perhaps we imagined. He announced the end of PFI and, more controversially, the end of PF2. Now, there's no secret that Jim O'Sullivan, for example, would tell anybody, I'm sure he's told several people in this room, that as far as his two major projects were concerned, Stonehenge and LTC, Lower Thames Crossing, that he was looking to the private sector to actually finance those schemes. Now, those of us who heard him this morning will have heard him say that actually both schemes have committed funding. So it's worth just asking us the question, which in a sense has arisen since we put this issue on the agenda for today, whether there is in fact any appetite for private funding in the UK road perspective. We haven't seen much of it to date. What we have seen in terms of the Birmingham Northern Relief Road, the M6 toll, as it's probably better known, hasn't been a sparkling success. So what is the future? Why is there a future? And do we still need more money? Well, I think we can answer that question very clearly. Despite the settlement, despite what I thought was a really good speech by Jesse Norman earlier on today, committing the government not just to major roads but to minor roads, the green highways agenda, it's quite clear that we still need more investment in our roads. So where do you get it? Well, look, for example, at why it is the Chancellor decided that PFI should effectively be abolished. The bulk of PFIs, particularly those relating to schools and hospitals, were arranged by the government of the day so that the contractor actually raised their own finance and essentially charged it back to the government, thus creating for the government a nice new hospital, which no doubt a minister could cut the ribbon of, but a burden in perpetuity for not only that minister, but his or her children and grandchildren. And the cost of those schemes, of course, has become, in a sense, a national scandal. One of the egregious aspects of those deals was that there is one thing that the government does better than anybody else. And speaking as a former minister, I have to be very careful when I say it, but it happens to be true. That the one thing that government can do better than even the largest multilateral global corporation is borrow money cheaply. So if we were really looking for value, PFI should not have been a case of loading the debt and the interest onto the contractor, who clearly has to be rewarded for that burden and passes the debt back on to the taxpayer. We should have been looking instead at risk transfer. and ensuring that risk is allocated either in the public or the private sector wherever it can be best managed. For example, in relation to the London Underground, which I had some involvement in, when we looked at the risk that contractors would have in refurbishing some of our old, as you know, 19th century tunnels, the risk of calamitous failure is real in circumstances like that, but the risk was clearly more cheaply borne by the public sector than the private sector. Had we transferred it, the effect would have been that the private contractor inevitably would have had to insure against that risk and would have passed the cost of that insurance, no doubt plus a premium, back onto the taxpayer. There are circumstances where it's right that the public sector should finance and the private sector accept a given level of risk. So my view is that there remains open to us in terms of funding at least one option, which isn't even particularly new, and that's DBFO, Design, Build, Finance and Operate. When you're doing a design, build, finance and operate, it's very clear that you are, as the contractor, taking a very considerable proportion of risk. And the reason why in the UK DBFO hasn't yet been a success has been because at least 3 key risks are too great for pension funds, whether UK or indeed external pension funds, to take. The first is what's called legislative risk. Bluntly, the risk of getting planning consent. I don't know how many people in this room are old enough to remember the background to the Birmingham Northern Relief Road, but when the contractor at that stage knew that the government was in favour of the scheme, I think they generally assumed that planning consent would be pretty automatic. In the event, planning consent took heavily contested years and literally millions of pounds of fees, legal fees and so on, fighting tooth and nail to get consent for the scheme. And that simply sent a message to the rest of the marketplace, which is that legislative risk is simply unacceptable in terms of investment in projects of that sort. The second is construction risk. How much is this actually going to cost? Are you able to tell me accurately enough that I know what it is that I'm going to have to lay out before I get any income at all? And our record on that has been patchy. One of the great things that Jim O'Sullivan talked about this morning, you remember, was the huge success of the A14, which is that it's actually going to be delivered on time and on budget. And the reason that he said it and was proud of it is because that's a rarity. I'm not blaming him or indeed any of his predecessors, it's just a fact of life and everybody in this room knows it. So alongside legislative risk, you also have to put construction cost risk. And the third, of course, is then revenue risk. Anybody looking at the one example we've got, and when I mention the Birmingham Northern Relief Road, it's because, as you'll probably appreciate, it's one of the very few examples of where we did actually get a private contractor to build a piece of roadway and to accept the revenues as a compensation. There were calculations as to the likely usage of the scheme, and those calculations fell well short of actuals. Now, if you were to take Stonehenge, for example, there the risk is that if you toll the A303 around Stonehenge, you simply divert a greater portion of traffic onto the M4, M5 in terms of London to Devon, and the risk is therefore that whatever technical projections you get from Highways England as to what you're likely to receive, that may be substantially less. And the same is true of the Lower Thames crossing. Most of you will know what the line of route looks like for the Lower Thames crossing. And the answer is, if you were to persuade me to go in an arc rather than a straight line, you're going to have to make it economically worth my while. Now that means that the charge will have to be regulated by government. And when it is, that presents again a risk to private capital. So my conclusion
is that if we are to get new finance into these sort of road schemes, it'll be on the basis of Highways England, the Treasury, ultimately standing behind them, giving a essentially cap and collar guarantee in the way that you'll find the pension funds accept in relation to build-to-rent housing schemes. The collar is a minimum revenue on which the contractor can base the reward that they're going to get from the given scheme. The cap is the level at which, if revenues exceed a certain proportion, then a given amount is then rebated back to the Treasury. The risks that remain with the contracting party are the cost of construction, and it seems to me that that's one that should fairly level with the contractor, and the legislative risk, well, that's the responsibility of government. It really is ludicrous in this country that we spend so much of our time and so much effort on planning alone when projects can literally take a decade to get off the ground. I won't even begin to mention airports where, in some cases, you could argue we've been planning for a third runway at Heathrow for about 30 years. I just want to make one other comment about this whole business of private finance. Road user charging is inevitable, and it will happen as the next car that you buy will be so much more fuel efficient than the one that you trade in. And in other words, fuel duty is beginning to disappear. The OBR says it's beginning to fall off a cliff. And if you look at the OBR's own projections, the likelihood is, in terms of the way we see the automotive market developing, that they are underestimating the extent to which revenues are rapidly reducing. Road user charging is always said to be unpopular with the public at large, and no doubt it is. They've seen it so far as just another way for the government to stick its hand in your pocket. But actually, road user charging will be the proposition that it'll be the Chancellor of the Exchequer who will insist on, because the roughly 30 billion that we raise from fuel duty doesn't pay for roads, doesn't even pay for roads, rails, aviation and shipping. It actually pays for schools and hospitals and a great deal of other public spending alike. The alternative to just letting fuel duty dribble away into the sand is to raise income tax by about 5 pence in the pound, or, if you like, add about 4% to corporation tax, to massively lower the threshold for inheritance tax. In other words, do an awful lot of equally unpopular things. And why not take the last great free utility, which is what roads are, and make them pay? Actually, these days, it wouldn't even involve gantries. It would be in the vehicle. And as you know, one of the original reasons why the scheme was not proceeded with was that in the days when, if you were running a scheme like this, it would be run on ANPR cameras and on gantries, the installation cost would run into tens of billions. Nowadays, it's an almost zero cost. It'll happen. It'll happen because, as I say, the gap between fuel duty and the needs of the economy will dictate it. And what that gives us, of course, is something that we don't get from fuel duty, which is the ability to nudge behavior. Because the addition means of a road user charging system, a differential charge by time of day or by type of road, giving us much better productivity out of the given amount of road space that we have than we currently get. I think it's absolutely inevitable. So I leave those thoughts there. First, DBFO with cap and collar, where risk is properly transferred, where it's appropriate to do so, to the private sector, and the inevitability in the medium, not the long term, that we will move from fuel duty to road user charging.